All right, let's dive into one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. You know the story of the Exodus, and you definitely know the villain, the incredibly powerful Pharaoh of Egypt, who goes head-to-head with Moses and the 10 plagues. But here's the weird part. His name is never, ever mentioned. That makes him probably the most famous, anonymous character in all of history. So you have to ask, right? If the Exodus was a real event that happened in history, then there must have been a real guy on the throne. So who was he? For literally centuries, scholars and archaeologists have been digging into this, and the real mystery, it turns out, is way more interesting than just finding a name. Now, if you've seen a movie about this, especially the epic The Ten Commandments, you probably have a very clear picture in your head. It's Yul Brynner, right, as the stubborn, defiant Ramesses the Great. That has pretty much become the default answer for most people. And look, it is rooted in some pretty compelling archaeological clues.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. When you go back to the actual text, to the book of Exodus itself, you find something that's kind of shocking. It never once gives the Pharaoh a personal name. Not the one who enslaved the Israelites, not the one who issued that horrifying decree about the babies, and not the one who hardened his heart against God. And get this, that's not an accident. It's a deliberate choice. And that right there is our first major clue that this whole mystery is a lot more theological than we might think. So, to understand why he's left unnamed, we first have to look at the name he is given. The clue isn't buried in some Egyptian tomb. It's hiding in plain sight, right there in the word itself. So, the word Pharaoh itself is this massive clue. It actually comes from the Egyptian term Pharaoh, and you know what that means? The Great House. For most of Egypt's history, it wasn't a name for the king at all, but for the palace, the whole royal system. It only started being used for the individual ruler right around the time the Exodus might have happened. So think about what the biblical author is doing here. By only using a title that means great house, they're making a huge statement. The enemy here isn't just one guy sitting on a throne. It's the entire system, the whole institution of imperial power, the entire house of Egypt that has put itself in opposition to God. But, okay, just because there's a deep theological point being made doesn't mean we can't do a little historical detective work. I mean, the story is set in the real world, so let's check out the leading historical candidates for the job. When you get down to it, historians are pretty much split into two main camps. You've got the late date theory, which points to our pop culture favorite, Ramesses II, around 1250 BC. And the big piece of evidence for that is that the Bible mentions the Israelites building a city called Ramesses. Makes sense. But then you have the early date theory, which puts the Exodus way back around 1446 BC, and this is based on a very specific timeline given in the book of 1 Kings. And that earlier dates, it points to a totally different guy, Amenhotep II. And you know, if we follow that early date timeline, this story starts to click into place really neatly. You'd have Moses being born around 1526 BC under a major pharaoh like Thutmose I. He flees Egypt 40 years later, and then the Exodus itself happens right in the middle of the reign of Amenhotep II. And the case for Amenhotep II gets really compelling when you look at the details. First off, we know from historical records he wasn't the firstborn son. His older brother was supposed to be king. Well, that means Amenhotep himself would have survived the 10th plague. Second, his own successor, the next pharaoh, had to create this special monument, the Dream Stela, to explain why the gods picked him for the job, which heavily implies the actual heir was gone. And finally, Egypt's military, which was basically unstoppable, just goes quiet after 1446 BC, kind of consistent with, say, losing your entire army of chariots in the Red Sea. Okay, so the historical evidence is fascinating, for sure. But it just brings us right back to the central question. If the author maybe knew who it was, why leave him unnamed? The answer, it turns out, shifts this whole story from a political squabble to an all-out cosmic showdown. This line right here is everything. This is when the battle lines are officially drawn. Moses shows up, delivers God's message, and Pharaoh asks the fundamental question of the entire book. It's not just him being dismissive, it's a direct challenge. It's one claim of absolute power against another. Pharaoh, who's seen as a god on earth, is literally asking, okay, who's really in charge here? And the story frames the answer to that question as a full-scale war. But not a war against soldiers. A war against the gods of Egypt. The plagues aren't just random, terrible disasters. They are a systematic, targeted takedown of the entire Egyptian divine order. Just think about it. The Nile, the absolute source of all life in Egypt, turns to blood.
That's a direct shot at their Nile god, Hapi. Then, a darkness so total it can be felt covers the whole land. That's a public smackdown of Ra, the sun god, the most powerful god in their entire pantheon. And then, the final plague, the death of the firstborn. That is the ultimate strike. It hits the divine king himself, proving that the god of a bunch of slaves has power over the life and the legacy of the supposed god king.
So, by refusing to give this man a name, the story elevates the whole conflict. Pharaoh stops being just a historical guy like Amenhotep or Ramesses. He becomes a symbol, an archetype of any and all human power that puffs itself up and claims an authority that belongs only to God. His anonymity is what makes him timeless.
And this is where the pure genius of the story really shines through. Because by turning Pharaoh into this archetype, the story becomes a powerful tool for understanding oppression, not just back then, but in any age. The story, then, is giving us a pattern to look for. Pharaoh is the great house, any powerful institution, any empire that enslaves and exploits people and just refuses to listen to a higher moral voice. He's left unnamed so that we can put his face on the oppressive systems of any era.
And what's amazing is later biblical writers did exactly that. When the prophets wrote about the brutal Babylonian Empire, they used the language of Exodus, calling Babylon the new Egypt. When the gospel writers describe the Roman Empire under King Herod, they subtly paint him with a Pharaoh-like brush. And the book of Revelation? Its ultimate villain, the beast, is just a cosmic echo of Pharaoh, a nameless, monstrous institutional power standing against God. So that blank space where the name should be, it's not a flaw in the historical record. It's the whole point. It's an invitation. The author leaves the name blank, not because he didn't know it, but so that every generation, including ours, can learn to identify the great houses of our own time. So in the end, the whole search for one specific name, while it's a really fascinating historical puzzle, it kind of misses the ultimate point. The text wants us to stop asking who was Pharaoh back then and to start asking a much harder, more uncomfortable question. Who is Pharaoh now? The story leaves him nameless, not to hide his identity, but to teach us how to recognize his face whenever it appears in the world around us.